So this is the third lecture. You remember I said at the beginning that I wanted to present you with three main figures who will be like types. And we started with Portrait of Sisters by Plamondon, you remember, and then I expressed during that course that it was image completely exterior, if you want, not getting very deep in the personality of the people who are represented. And then last time we deal with Ozias Leduc, and then right away we were dealing more with the, what I call the inner world, if you want, the world of imagination, of dream, of love. And you saw how the Leduc approached the problem from two sides, I would say, from a kind of symbolic side, like in this painting, the phrenology, where in fact it is a kind of interpretation of painting itself that he presented there. And even the phrenology bust itself could be seen as an image of paintings. It reveals the interior by the exterior, if you want. Today we will go a little bit deeper, and I want to insist today on one aspect that I didn't mention maybe enough, and that is very important in the progress of this internalization of values that you have in Quebec and in the rest of Canada also, with the 40s and the 50s, let's say a little bit later. We will deal now with the association of this inner world with freedom. I think it's important to see that when you let's say, make this inner world free, it can express itself also exteriorly and even politically. And so the people who will deal with it, we will see, will make this kind of transition between a new discovery of imagination, of poetry, and of whatever is in the mind, and with eventually with politics, with action in the real world. The first one we will deal with, the first artist we'll deal with, is Alfred Pellan, P-E-L-L-E-N. And I want to show you first a series of work he did just after his return from Europe. You see, like many other painters, he thought the real thing to do is to quit the province of Quebec and to be in Paris, let's say, and to be in contact with all the master and all the new trends there. And he did that for 14 years. Pellan was outside of Quebec for all this period. And indeed, he took contact with Picasso, with Miro, with their paintings. And really, when he will come back with all these new ideas and all that, he will be really like a sensation. But just after his return, he met another painter who's called Philippe Seurat. And both of them got friendly enough to even share the same studio for a while. Seurat was nice. He said, if you come to Montreal, you can share my studio. And in a few weeks, let's say that you will get organized here in Montreal. And he also made him meet people like Jory Smith, Jean Palardy. This was an interesting couple. Let's say Palardy was become a filmmaker and also one of the best specialists, let's say, of the old furniture in Quebec. And it was a man of many interests and a very lively guy. And Jory Smith is a painter. He's still living and still active. And they met Pellan at the time, through Seurat, I guess. And then they met Lyman, John Lyman. Anyway, right away, Pellan was in a nice group of, let's say, modern artists. Then he was invited by Jory Smith and Palardy to come to visit them in the Charlevoix County. That means near Quebec City, if you want, but much more to the east. And it's a place who have a kind of reputation of being very picturesque. And Pellan accepted their invitation, went there in the 40s and went back even in 1941. And it is probably more in the second stay at Charlevoix, that he began to paint things that were surprising for his backer, if you want, because they were rather realistic painting. For instance, he painted a portrait de Fillette. When you look at it, a Fillette en rouge, when you look at it, you don't have the impression that she's a very, let's say, a young girl, huh? Because Fillette normally means a girl. And in fact, it's already somebody who, even if she's very young, have already the aspect of an adult. Huh? And then you have also this Fillette à la robe bleue, Fillette aux lunettes, as if he says in an interview much later that he just met these girls that were familiar to Jory Smith. They were having posed already as a model for Jory Smith. So he said they used to come home and I sketched them and then I did this picture. Like if I did also, he says, some landscape, and he says, my intention was to show that even an abstract painter like me could make very realistic picture, and I wanted to make a kind of rapprochement with the public. Now, this is what he declared. As if also the subject matter was not very important there, just the Fillette, the little girls around coming to visit Jory Smith and accepting to pose for him. But when you look at them, they look really not like happy children. They look really hard, as if they are almost, say, with one old already glasses in her hand, as if her sight is not very good, and they have kind of very bony type of structure. They are almost rickety also a little bit. You feel that these children are not coming from just being in the country and happy and all this. They come from misery, in fact. And indeed, when you think of it, the region of Charlevoix at the time was a kind of very hard place to live because they just finished the famous crash, the economic turn down that we had in the 1929. And then in 41, of course, it was the beginning of the war. It was the beginning of the Second World War. And it was a tough period for that region especially. And so the subject matter there is not neutral or just something that happens to be there and that Pelin decided to use. Even in one of his pictures, you see kids looking at him painting, so that's why they are in the painting. They are a little bit far, and he seems not even mentally normal. You know, some of them seem to be like with Down syndrome, and others, they look like really affected by their situation. And indeed, in Baie-Saint-Paul, nearby, where they were, I think, in La Petite Rivière Saint-François, in this region of Charlevoix, there was in Baie-Saint-Paul a huge orphelinat. You know, that means an immense structure, an architecture, a convent, in fact, in which the Franciscan sisters were taking care of all these children who have been without parents or abandoned, and because of the very, I would say, foolish type of natalist ideology of the church at the time. Say you have to make children, big family and all that, and these people were not really in a position to take care of them. So all these images were, in fact, already quite involved, let's say, even if Pelin described them later as a little bit with certain detachment. But in fact, they were a kind of representation of a tough period in this region of the world. When he came back with this in Montreal and showed them in his studio in an exhibition organized by Maurice Gagnon, I show you a portrait of Gagnon by Paul-Émile Bordua, and you see him here chatting with de Tenancourt in the middle and with Robert Elie in this exhibition organized in the studio of Pelin in Montreal. When these paintings were shown there, the critics who were already very enthusiastic about the abstract art of Pelin, well, abstract in brackets because, as you will see, it's not, there's always some figuration in Pelin. It's never completely abstract. But they were very different from what the people were used to before. And so that's why they call it abstract art. They were fascinated by the color, by the freedom of form and everything. When they saw this painting done in Charlevoix-Comté, they were a little bit taken aback. Huh? Some speak even of an incartade of Pelin. An incartade in French, it's almost a prank, as if he was not completely inside of this painting, as if you want just to make a demonstration. So the critics who were very close to him and defending the modern art, the modern art trend, if you want, were insisting on the continuation between his abstract painting and this new figurative painting. But other critics who were more traditional will say, enfin, you see Pelin come back to nature and it's fun. Il s'humanise. They become more human than before. And you feel that some of the previous critics were worried about that, that if Pelin goes in that direction, he will be lost for the cause of modern art. Huh? So you can understand that the kind of turmoil that these presentation of realistic painting did in the critic of the time. Huh? In fact, the real reason, okay, the official reason is that Pelin wanted to make a rapprochement with the public. But in fact, once and this is typically Pelin, he says, you know, he says, I have a worry character. And he says, I always shift like that from abstract to figurative, always not being completely sure of myself, of the trend to follow. And I have this kind of worry character. And indeed, maybe that was one of the aspect behind this. You see, this idea of going back and shifting like that and finding his way. Then in 1943, Pelin is hired by the School of Fine Arts in Montreal. At the time, the director of the school was Charles Maillard, and Maillard was happy to have Pelin because he thought this will be good for our student to have a modern artist. You know, we have others, but Pelin is the more avant-garde of them all, and says maybe it will be good for our student. And there is a painting of Pelin done exactly at the same time when he's hired to the Beaux-Arts, and it's called La Surprise Académique, the academic surprise, if you want, in 1943, in which you see, how do you call it, a jack in the box, if you want, coming out from a kind of structure, and in which he's dressed like a clown. He has upside down face and with really like a clown happening like this in the picture. And then if you look on the right, you see a huge colossus, let's say in gray, who is the academism also, who have been put down, let's say, by the apparition of the clown, who is the modern artist. And around the scene, all around it, you see, I would say, a lot of autobiographical notation of Pelin. For instance, anything who can evoke the railways is typical of the childhood of Pelin, because his father was a train engineer, and he remembered to have brought his son with him in the big locomotive, you know. So for Pelin, this was a wonderful souvenir of his childhood. And also you see evocation of his art, like the brushes, the colors and all that. So that surrounded this Surprise Académique. And I think this painting summarizes exactly what will happen. With the time, Pelin class become the place where the students were trying new avenue and discover modern art and Picasso and all the trends that we were not used to, and they become more and more free in a way. Nevertheless, the School of Fine Arts was a school where you were supposed to go through an academic training. You see, first drawing and drawing and drawing, and finally color, and finally volume and everything. So you learn from copying plaster cast and image of antiquity, if you want, and also with models, and finally you were more free. But one big event, that will happen in 1945, in June 1945, was what you should call the student exhibition at the end of the year. But just before that, there was a lecture in Montreal given by Fernand Léger. And Fernand Léger, of course, is one of the most famous painter of the School of Paris. And he was, you will ask him what he was doing during the war in Montreal. Well, he was since a long time already in New York City, giving lecture there and also having his own little academy, if you want, with students. And because he was French-speaking, he was also happy to come from time to time to Quebec and to Montreal. And he befriended Pelin, he befriended Maurice Gagnon and others. And so they invited him to give a lecture that he called Les Formes Humaines dans l'Espace, which is the type of painting that he was doing at that period. I show you one example here of the so-called divers. So it's human form, but completely free of any context. They just float one above the others like this with color in the space. But during his lecture, Léger made a little reflection about academism, and he says any student who applied himself could make the portrait of his grandmother in 3 weeks, as if you need 3 weeks of lesson to be able to do that. And at the end, with the applause of the crowd, you hear suddenly, among the applause, many students shouting, "À bas Maillard et l'académisme," and down with Maillard, who is the director of the school, and academism. And this was a kind of ominous for what will happen after. And Maillard heard about this, and he asked Pelin to come to his office and really got very angry with him. He says, "What is this? You encourage this type of behavior from our students." And why he thought that Pelin was involved there? It is because Pelin was a friend of Léger, if you want, and even it seems that Léger lived at his place when he came in Montreal. So there was evidently something to do with Pelin. But it stayed there. When they made their exhibition of the end of the year in June 1945, then suddenly Maillard asked Pelin again to his office, and he said, "There's 2 paintings there that come from your class, and will be maybe badly perceived by the public." And the 2 paintings one was a nude, and he called it de réalisme solide. The other one was a scene of the Last Supper, but who seems to be a little bit irreverential, you see, too modern, if you want. So he asked Pelin to remove these 2 paintings. And Pelin was, at first, agree with this, and then suddenly he says, "Oh no, this is bad for these students, they work so hard." And also when you will remove 2 paintings from the show, showing what I do in my class, it will be really 2 big holes. And it's just 2 days before the opening of the exhibition. I have no time really to change that. So he got suddenly an idea. He thought, he says to the 2 students, "Try to modify a little bit your painting, and you will remain in the show. Do it with gouache on oil paint. The painting are oils, so do it with gouache. It's easy to remove after with water, and you will have your painting as they were." And so the guy who made the nude succeeded to put a little bikini on it, and the other transformed the Last Supper in a kind of I would say almost a tavern scene, in which everybody drinks, and the calice become a buck of beer and a glass of beer, and he erased any allusion to religion and things like that, and he thought everything was okay. Then, when Maillard saw that the painting were not removed but just modified, he got even more angry and got them out of the exhibition. And this created a complete havoc, let's say, at the opening of the exhibition when the student had prepared, we don't know exactly how, but they had little stickers, big like this, in which it was written "Abat Maillard et l'Académiste," and they glued them everywhere in the school, on the walls, on the painting, and shouted, of course, as much as they want. Maillard had the police coming to the place, but everything apparently finished, not too bad. People went each one on his side. So this is, in a way, one of the first manifestations where you see this conquest of freedom is suddenly translated in the real world. What was exactly the position of Pellin and of Maillard in all this? It's a little bit unclear, because you have two versions of what happened. What I just told is very close to the version given by Charles Maillard himself. When he was asked what happened exactly to journalists, so he says, more or less what it says, that Pellin have deliberately tried to scandalize a little bit the public, and then by removing the painting and just painting on them and modifying them, show that he had the intention not to remove them, and finally that he had no choice that to ask that the painting will be removed. And also that all this manifestation was more or less organized by Pellin, and that he was responsible even probably of these little stickers that he put everywhere. When Pellin was asked what exactly happened, he gave another point of view in a way. He seems to be honestly trying to find a way outside of this mess, that by asking the student to modify their picture, he thought that was an acceptable way. The nude was no more provocative, and the scene, or the Last Supper scene, was now not religious, so should not create any problem. But you see, whatever really was the intention of everybody there, it is remarkable, nevertheless, that there was now a translation in the real world, let's say, of all these modern ideas that were slowly seeping in the ethos of Quebec, I would say. Just to end that story about Maillard and Pellin and all this, in December after, say the exhibition was in June, in December after, in 1945, Maillard gave his demission as the director of the school. He was replaced by Monsieur Charlebois, not by Pellin, of course, because Pellin didn't want to be a director of school, but suddenly, more or less what they were expecting happened. It seems that the reason of the demission of Maillard was health problem, so it's calmed everything down, and it was like a step done in the history of this revolt, let's say, in Quebec. And the other painter I would like to speak about in that atmosphere, and we'll see, we will go a little bit deeper in his type of art and how he was interested by something else. It is Paul-Émile Bordua. Paul-Émile Bordua was born in Saint-Hilaire. He was the student, or let's say the apprentice, I would say, of Ozias Leduc for a while. Here you have his portrait when he finished the School of Fine Arts, meaning that through the influence of Leduc, he went also to the School of Fine Arts as a student, but of course before what I told you about Pellin, really at the beginning of the school in 1927, and he followed all the 4 years and finally ended up with the diploma to be able to teach in the primary school of Montreal, and to teach drawing there. To the kids. And for him, okay, that was maybe his fate. And one day, he came in one of the class that he was supposed to be given in Le Plateau, and there was somebody there. was giving the class already. So he got surprised and mad, and he said, what is this? And the guy who was giving the lecture in his place, in a way, was a man called Léopold Dufresne. He's an artist, and he's an artist even interesting in the history of Quebec because his family and him will be very close to Molinari family. And Guido Molinari, of course, is an abstract painter of very great importance later, let's say, than the period I'm dealing with. But it's funny that the concurrent, if you want, of Bordeaux at the time was Léopold Dufresne, who will become a friend of Molinari. Then, when Bordeaux saw that, he was very mad, he was very surprised, and decided to give his letter of demission to the school of, to the Montreal School Board, to be able to be free from them since they are not honest with them. Anyway, he took a very hard step like this. This was not completely clever because you were at the eve of the crash of 1929 when he did that. And so then to find another job would have been probably very, very difficult. Anyway, he was lucky. Both Le Duc and Monseigneur Moreau that you see on this picture, if you see the first row and you go from the right to the left, is the second ecclesiastic that you see there, very well dressed in red and everything. Monseigneur Moreau will be also not only the vicar of the Church Notre Dame, but also the president of Université de Montréal for a while. So it's a big canon, if you want. And Moreau was friend of Le Duc. They knew each other well. And they decided that this young Bordeaux could be maybe sent to Paris and could become one of their religious painters, a little bit like Le Duc was. And they sent him to des ateliers de Maurice Denis, des ateliers d'art sacré in Paris. So Bordeaux was very happy because he was without nothing, he had no jobs anymore. So suddenly they gave him money to go to Paris and to become an apprentice at Maurice Denis' famous Atelier d'Art Sacré. And indeed, for a while, for a year and a half or something, Bordeaux will be there following a little bit what was happening in Paris at the time, but certainly not as much as Pellan did. You know, he was with these religious people, and he was involved also in some church decoration in La Meuse. And so it's certainly not as open, let's say, to the modern trends at that time than Pellan was. For instance, in this painting that I show you now, you see one of his friends, Mademoiselle Henriette Cheval, at the time, but behind her, there is a kind of square motif, which is indeed a motif of stained glass that Bordeaux did in Maurice Denis' class, and that probably brought with him in Canada. It's lost now. We know it through photos and through preparatory drawing, but the stained glass itself disappeared. Then Bordeaux returned to Quebec, finally jobs in Collège Grasset, and finally to the École du Meuble in Montreal. In 1935, he replaced Jean-Paul Lemieux, who went to Quebec, and he found a job there finally. And this was, of course, the milieu in which he was more happy and more efficient. He did some figurative painting, even up to 1941, let's say, in which you could see a kind of a reference to what we were speaking before at the very beginning of this series of lecture. This is a portrait of Madame G. Madame G happens to be my mother. I will explain you what is the connection here. But let's say, if you look at the picture, it is again a portrait of a kind of a woman with certain interiority, a little bit like the nuns of Plamondon that we saw before, a little bit like the portrait of the dreamers that we saw in Ozias Leduc. She even have a kind of a white halo, let's say, behind her head, and making her maybe like a figure of a saint, if you want. what we know about the relation between Bordua and Madame G and Monsieur G, my father, let's say Maurice Gagnon, they were quite close for a while because Gagnon, Maurice Gagnon was a hard critic, and he was the first to write an important article on Bordua and can claim maybe to almost to have discovered this important painter. And my mother was more interested in philosophy, and she followed courses of Dominican priests at the time and things. And so both of them were discussing a lot about form and matter and the proof of existence of God and things like that. So the subject was at the edge, let's say, of religion and philosophy between my mother and Bordua. But I just tell that to stress one aspect, that this kind of internal world of the past, let's say, is still quite present in Quebec at the time. And when Bordua want to be what he called a monist, that means not making distinction between soul and body, between mind and the external world and all that. This was, of course, against the mainstream of thought at the time. And you could say that my mother would represent the other time. You have also a portrait of his wife, of Gabrielle Bordua, who is a little bit with the same type of ambiguity. In one portrait, of course, he's just sitting in a chair, and it's a nice portrait, a little bit à la Matisse, if you want. But the other is more troubling in a way. She's half naked, showing her breast, and she's playing mandolin, and she's in front, in fact, of a kind of a vitrage type of presentation. And this kind of lozenges that you see looks a little bit like a stained glass. And so the stained glass will be associated with religion, but a half-naked woman, of course, is from another world, more sensuous and all that. What happened, the shift in Bordua thinking from, let's say, what he got from Ozias-le-Duc, this opening on the inner world that you see a little bit in these figurative painting of 41. What happened during that period also, he discovered one important trend with surrealism. And I show you here the portrait of André Breton because Breton will become a kind of a very important influence on Bordua. And Bordua was not a big reader, but he knew enough about Breton and about surrealism to understand that this will change a lot of things in his perception of painting, but his perception also of politics, if you want, and even of the whole culture of Quebec. Why Breton is important for Bordua? Because he discovered, let's say, what we call the automatic writing. And Breton himself tell the story how he discovered it. Going to sleep, and then suddenly he saw an image in his mind that was representing, he says, a man walking, but split in two by a window. As if, you imagine a man standing, and as if at the level of his belt, he had a window like this. Kind of strange image. Go to sleep, then the image popped out like this. Then he made a connection with what you could call kind of spontaneous writing of the same time. He says, if I was at my desk and I was just writing what popped to my mind like this, maybe I will get metaphor or get image of the same type that I got like this in my sleep. He was referring then to one type of écriture automatique, if you want, that was practiced by the spirit. Let's say how do you call them, the mediums or the psychic, if you want. And they had this idea that, let's say, a pen could come like this and without anybody holding it, could write And this is what's called écriture directe. And then you read the message, and of course it comes from the spirits, and it tells you something, what to do, and everything. L'écriture automatique then is a less spectacular type of thing, since it's somebody take a pen and write whatever come to his mind, but as if his hand was let's say, pushed by the influence of the spirit, and that the message that he write was not really conscious. It just come like this, and he read it after, and he says he could interpret it, the message after the fact, let's say. This idea was, of course, dismissed by the psychologists or the psychoanalysts of the time, like Freud, and all that. This is okay. This message, in fact, is not from the spirits, but it comes from your unconscious, and you write something that you are not conscious, but that reveals maybe some of your desire or whatever, and that's why it works like this. But then Breton thought, he says, okay, this is fantastic because it's kind of a notation of thought as it happened, you know, and then it seems that you could create like this a kind of poem with very strange type of association of word. And this, he says, I wanted to experiment myself. He says, I was reading Freud. I was fascinated by his method of interpreting dreams. And indeed, Freud have written an important book, the Traumdeutung, that means the interpretation of dreams, in 1900, I think. And in this book, Freud explained that there's two levels in a dream. You have the manifest dream. That's what the story that people who dreams are telling you. And you have a latent dream, meaning that if you ask your dreamer to associate with each section of the dream what was his thinking about, and if you let them freely associate with this little part of the dream, with whatever come to his mind, suddenly you find a certain structure there that was not apparent in the manifest dream, but is very apparent when you put all the elements together, and habitually reveal a kind of suppressed desire, something that we don't really want to tell ourselves or to be really conscious about. It's there somewhere in the unconscious, but when you make this association, suddenly it popped out. In fact, the real master of Breton about this conception of the unconscious was more Pierre Janet, who was like the French rival of Freud. And Janet was not speaking of unconscious, he was speaking of subconscious. As if, again, there was two levels. There was a level of where people are reasonable and conscious, but under this, you have a kind of complete mental disorganization, especially with mentally sick people. You find when you go deeper in the subconscious, a kind of chaos. And he says that's a problem. We have to put these people more and more rational and to help them to get out of this mental chaos. This was not at all the idea of Freud. Freud speaks of conflict in the unconscious, but he speaks of also an extraordinary logic of its own. And it's not at all like the subconscious of Janet. But for Breton, the idea that you have a kind of mental chaos in the bottom like this, and that you could reveal it by the automatic writing, was a fantastic idea. Because then you could have in this disorganization of the rational thought, maybe a thought much more interesting, full of imagination, full of ressemblance and hybrids and whatever, that in fact could create a fantastic poem. And he did experience with his friend Philippe Soupeau of this écriture automatique. He explained exactly how they did. He says, you get in a room, a little bit dark, and people bring you the paper and the pen and everything, and you get it in a mental state where you empty your mind of everything, especially of any idea of making a literary piece or a poem or something like that, and you just write as fast as you can, any idea that came to your mind. And you just write like this, one after the other. If you are a little bit hesitation at a certain moment, put an E or put an L and go on. And of course, E or L in French are very good letters because you have le, la, le, you have of course, you could make as much association with these letters. And the texts you obtain, in fact, were a little bit strange. Huh? I will quote you in French one little line of Breton, of this kind of écriture automatique, and I will try to translate it, but you will see. For instance, he says, dans la craie de l'école, il y a une machine à coudre. Encore. La craie, it's the chalk. And the l'école, you know what it is, the school. It says, so in the chalk that you have in a school, there is a sewing machine. So then, of course, what happened, it is association of two things that have nothing to do in common that come like this to his mind because he writes without any preconceived idea, just what come like this through his pen. Il continue. Les petits enfants secouent leurs boucles de papier argenté. So the small children shake their heads with their little curls, let's say, who are like covered by paper with the gloss of silver, if you want. So, petits enfants, school, okay, you are more or less in the same type of universe. Huh? But again, this the silver that appear there and the fact that they shake their heads like this is kind of unexpected. Le ciel, il continue, est un tableau noir sinistrement effacé par le vent de minute en minute. Alors, the sky is like a blackboard, sinistré, ominously erased by the wind minute by minute. So you see, this is a typical text that he obtained like this by creating a lot of association were unexpected, and that the poet Pierre Riverdi have very well defined. He says this type of image are not comparison. They are not making, like in classic poetry, a comparison between two things, like, I don't know, comparing tears with the flow of water or something like that. No, he says these are pure association. One idea comes from one direction, the other from another direction, and it is very powerful when the two directions they come from are very far apart. He said if it's too obvious, it's not interesting, but if it is surprising, this is what makes écriture automatique. Okay, very good, but what do you do with painting? How do you transpose that in painting? And this is, of course, for Bordeaux, was the main problem, and like for all the surrealist painters. Then Breton told them, okay, go back to Leonardo da Vinci. He has a fantastic idea that you could use. He says, you should go in front of an old wall full of spots of paints and cracks and things like that, and look at it a little bit distractedly, and then suddenly you will see shapes, and you will be able to copy your vision, he says. This is true that it was in Leonardo da Vinci kind of textbook that he prepared for his student, and this is an advice that he gives them. If you want to find a fantastic subject matter who will be new and will bring you, he says, fame, go to an old wall, look at the cracks and get image like this, and then paint them on your canvas. But this was a nice way to put it, and Breton was very excited by that. He says, this is enfin the resolution of the main problem of life, the objectivity and subjectivity comes together. Why he say that? Because, of course, when you look at an whole wall, and if I look, we will see different things. Everybody have looked at clouds and try to find shapes in clouds, and each one have a different. I remember a kind of caricature of Snoopy, in which you see, I think, Charlie Brown looking at the clouds like this, and he says, "I see a horsey ducky and things like that. This one, he says, oh no, he says, I see the stoning of St. Stephen in front of the church. And so each one were looking at the same type of clouds, let's say, so a certain objectivity, but on the other hand, each one subjectively saw different thing. And you see why Breton says this is the reunion of both, that each person looking at these type of patterns will project in them, will interpret something else, and so they will bring a part of their subjectivity, but on the other hand, the source is the same for everybody. It's there, you just have to look at it. So the artists were not completely satisfied with this idea of copying vision. And so they decided to do something else, to say, why we don't do like you poets and use the rapidity of the eye to make association of image that already exist. And the master of this will be, in France, will be, and in Germany, will be Max Ernst. Max Ernst is a German painter who immigrated to Paris and was quite close to the Surrealist group, and Breton also admired his work and all that. And he thought in the collage, you will have a way to make this type of association that are quite similar to what the poet obtained by automatic writing. Well, here is a kind of a case of that. Max Ernst called it, it's the hat that makes the man. Okay, what he did, he cut out from magazine or whatever, depiction of hats, of man hats, and accumulate them one above the other like this, and after that trace some form to join them together. And he make like this a collage plus a gouache, if you want, to organize all this. And we obtain like this very strange type of image. Lucy Lippard, who is a great art critic, American art critic, thought that he was playing with phallic symbol, which is very possible. She wrote, the hat covers the head, formerly it resembled the cover of the head of the male organ. It is also a repressive factor, a cover-up, an overlay of civilization on the seat of subconscious. One tip one's hat, uncover, bare oneself, if you want, briefly, when saying good day, when communicating with others, especially ladies. That a view of European man in 1920 as a stuck-up, seedless puppet or mannequin repressed, oppressed, and manipulated by bourgeois capitalism, imprisoned in tight-fitting nerve clothes and much in need of uncovering his own reference. I think she got more or less quite close to, I think, the point that Ernst was trying to do here. But very, very early, the collage of Max Ernst will be very strange. In fact, he will not do only collage. He will do what he called overpainting. I think in German it's Übermaling. What he did, he took a page as such in a kind of I would say a catalog of objects that could be sold for making, let's say, lesson in anatomy or lesson for veterinary or school. So what you see on the right is one of the page of the catalog that he have used to make the drawings that you see on the left. The page of the catalog represent organs of horses. You see a larynx, you see a heart, you see a head of the horse, and then also the upper jaw, I think. And so he didn't touch anything, didn't cut anything, but added to this design, that is for picture, some links, let's say, that make it suddenly very strange and very bizarre. And he gave him, of course, a title that have nothing to do with what you see here. It's called The Dissolvable Snail, Le Limaçon de la Chambre Fusielle. Anyway, he goes on in French also in the title, what is written on the bottom and on the top of the picture there. So this type of Hubert painting is as if he was discovering by that in a kind of banal type of image from a catalog, if you want, suddenly possible association that make it suddenly very strange. Look at another example. I don't resist to show them together. Okay, on the left, of course, is the Hubert painting or the Hover painting of Max Ernst, and on the right is his sources. And you see that he suppressed a few things and he kept others, and it creates kind of mysterious type of personage looking at you with these glasses. What it was, in fact, it was serious stuff. It was things that this catalog was trying to sell to chemists, to be careful with their eyes and not to protect themselves when they go in the laboratory. And for Ernst, they become like a strange personage appearing like this in a kind of landscape that he recreates. Here, demonstration hydrometric is the same idea. You start from the page on the right, put it upside down, and then added some perspective and put some color, and then you get, again, a kind of mysterious type of presentation. You understand that the collage is a good solution of the problem of the automatic writing for painter. You obtain a kind of the similar type of metaphor, meaning to bring together things that are very far in reality, and you create a strange world, a kind of an uncanny world, by this association that reveals, in fact, the function of the unconscious. There is, of course, real collage in the works of Max Ernst. Like he make a whole book of it, and it was called The Woman with 100 Heads. And habitually, you start from an illustration that already exists and add to it some elements, like here this naked man who seems to pull the people down out toward heaven, maybe to get for the final judgment. In another series of collages that he made also, it's called Une semaine de bonté, a week of kindness, in which you see a kind of man looking at himself, but he have the head of one of these statues of the Easter Highlands. You remember the shape? And in the window appears suddenly a naked woman. One of the most disturbing one is this one, where you see a kind of strange man sitting in a train, like they were at the time, and they pass near a sphinx that looks at him very, very severely. Indeed, in front of him, there's a lady on the ground who seems to have been killed or who seems to be dead. So always you have a little bit of the atmosphere of a dream, because it's very realistic. He takes his source in image already existing, but the association is very strange. It's very like this surrealistic metaphor. Another painter who did exactly a little bit the same, but you will see even with more, I would say, unconscious content, is René Magritte. He's from Belgium, well, more or less associated with a surrealist also, but a very interesting painter without any association as such. Le jockey perdu, the lost jockey, if you want, represent a jockey on his horse, but he's in kind of strange landscape with this little instrument that you see is in fact a game. I remember in my childhood there was a ball and there was a kind of pin like this, and the ball was linked to the pin with a thread, and you throw the ball in the top, you have a little hole, and you have to catch it with a pin. It was called a bilboquet. And but also you can have also many versions of it with little, for instance, rings, pin and rings, instead of a little point with a ball. Here it's probably what he means by this bilboquet here in the background. And if you look carefully, they are linked to the horse legs by threads who looks like something that could stop the movement of the horse. That's why he called it the jockey perdu. He's lost in this landscape, who's strange with the bilboquet have branches who are black without leaves and things. When you know the personal story of Magritte, all the elements here could make sense a little bit. Magritte lost his mother when he was 13, and she committed suicide. She was a very depressed woman. And even if his father was a successful businessman and all that, she herself made many attempts of suicide and finally succeeded. And apparently it was the young René Magritte that found her floating in the Sambre River, and dead, of course, and having her dress in front of her face like this with the current. And an image that was, of course, absolutely horrible. And the bilboquet in his picture is in fact a kind of symbol of him being tossed one side to the other by his mother, because of course she was very inconsistent, if you want, in her feelings. Sometimes she was feeling better and she was nicer to her kids, and then suddenly she got in this depression and it was very far from them. So the bilboquet certainly is a kind of mother figure in the picture of Magritte, and you could say that the jockey is himself. He's like stuck with all these threads, and he cannot really advance. And later, he make another version of the same theme, which is even more strange, in which the landscape is completely dead, cold, with snow, and these trees without any leaves, and still the little jockey with his horse trying to run in this type of landscape. Here, I mentioned Magritte because one of the possibility of interpretation of this type of metaphor that I was speaking before seems so much absurd. If you know more about the psychology, let's say, of the painter, you could get in a little bit there. Of course, Magritte was very, very negative about psychoanalysis and didn't want any explanation of that kind. But nevertheless, it seems there that we touch something which is evident and close to the truth. Okay, so very good with the sources, let's say, of surrealism and how the idea of écriture automatique and how it was transposed in painting that we just saw. But what happened with our painter in Canada? And I will mention basically what happened with Bordua. Bordua was not very interested by the idea of the collage. We don't know any collage done by him. We know few by some of his automatist friends, but himself never touched it. And he understood the idea of the whole wall of Leonardo da Vinci that he read in Breton in a different way. He decided to recreate on his sheet of paper the very condition of the whole wall. So what that means, okay, you take a white piece of paper, and on it you trace some lines, let's say completely at random, and more or less this will give you the same effect, let's say, of the whole wall with these cracks and things. So the painting of Bordua coming from that are very different from what we have just seen. They seem much more abstract, like this one, the number one, gouache that he made in 1942. And he called, you will see why, La Machine à Coudre. At first sight, it seems quite beautiful in color and shape and all this, but having nothing, no subject matter, certainly nothing as clear as what we saw in the painting of Magritte or even in Max Ernst's collage. And so how these paintings were done and how they can be called also in a way surrealist, we know it by a conversation that he had with Maurice Gagnon, and that Gagnon had the good idea to take notes after, in which he says the following. He says, I have no preconceived idea when I start my painting. I took my sheet of paper without any idea of what will happen. And then he says, in front of this page of paper, I take my charcoal and trace the first line. And he says, if the impulsion is to trace it in the middle or to trace it on the side, I don't discuss it, I do it. The first line then determines a little bit the second line. And then the third line is more determined because already there's two lines there being traces, and I have to build up slowly the drawing, he says. When the drawing is established, I do the same with the color. I take the first colors that took to my mind without any preconceived idea. It could be a red, it could be a green, it doesn't matter. But when the first color is put somewhere, it determines the others because I try to make some association of color that will be pleasant to the eye. And slowly, like this, the picture gets built. And at the end, eventually, I could give them a title, like here, La Machine à Coudre, because more or less, it have the shape of an old Singer machine. You remember these machines that our mothers or grandmothers used, say, with the pedal on the floor and with this needle here and a little kind of handle to turn the whole thing, because it was completely mechanical. So maybe there are some allusions to that. And you know, of course, also the famous line of Lautréamont when he says « Beau comme la découverte fortuite d'une machine à coudre et d'un parapluie sur une table de dissection ». So, bon, the allusion to Lautréamont also could be there. But it's not, what is important to know here, it is that Bourgeois didn't start doing his painting and saying, I will do a sewing machine. No, the sewing machine appeared at the end where the painting is done, and when you look at it from far and you say, okay, we can give him a title like this. In fact, the first title given to this picture were number 1, number 2, number 3. They were not associated with any literary title. It is a little bit under the pressure of the collectors that come to him and he says, okay, this is very nice. I bought number 22, but what I will say when I come home, you know, the people will ask you, what is this? So with time, he gave some title to the gouache in question. They were shown in l'Hermitage, and they were, most of them were sold at the time, and so finally they got these double title, if you want. About the interview with Maurice Gagnon, I think we could make few remarks. The first one, you understood what he means by peinture automatique, by automatic painting. It is precisely the idea of a non-preconceived idea. You start your painting without any subject matter, any idea of what will happen, but if the point of depart is very automatic, if you want, very spontaneous, well, with time it becomes more and more logical, because as he says, the first line determines the second one, the two first one determine the third one. So this determination with time make it much less automatic, if you want, with time. This is the first remark I want to do. The second remark, it is the insistence of Bourgeois of speaking of line, color, and nice association of color, a beautiful line that create the drawings and all that. This is interesting because it's not typical of the surrealists completely. When Breton says what is interesting in a painting, it is, I consider it as a window. What I want to see is not a window, it's on which landscape it opens. As if for Breton, what is interested in the subject matter, it is what you see through the painting. But the so-called plastic value, let's say the importance given to color, to form, to movement, or to rhythm in a painting, all this seems to be the whole way to do. You see, it's dépassé. And in Bourgeois, in the contrary, this plastic value are important. He was, after all, a student of Maurice Denis, and Maurice Denis was a big admirer of Cézanne. And of course, when you admire Cézanne, you attach a lot of importance to color and to form, to shape, and to how you organize your painting, to the composition. And because of that, you could say this aspect is not very typical of surrealism, the insistence on the plastic value. And third, you have been maybe struck by the fact that he starts with drawing and then goes to color. This is a reflection of the academic type of upbringing he had. This is exactly what they were told to do in the School of Fine Arts. You draw first, and then you put color in your drawing, and you finally get the picture. So he maintained this kind of dichotomy between drawing and color. And finally, he doesn't mention the fact that the very format of the sheet on which he works. You see, if you take the sheet vertically like this or horizontally, well, if you go with the spontaneous type of charcoal traces that you make at first, well, if your sheet is vertical, maybe you will have tendency to make a vertical line in the middle of it instead of just a little line in the corner. So maybe the very format that he was using was creating more or less a certain organization in the picture. I think this is exactly what happened. You have some picture like La Machine à Coudre who looks more like a still life, I would say, and others who are vertical looks more like portrait. And indeed, when you think of it, in 41, the two genres that Bourdieu have exploited more was the portrait and the still life. So as if the very structure of these two types of painting were in unconscious and came back to organize what was more, let's say, more abstract. So you can have many examples of gouache who are on the vertical format who looks a little bit like portrait, and others who are on the horizontal format like this, who looks rather like still life. They could have like also landscape, but not at that level. We will see later that it is with, when you go to oil paint, that suddenly is more interested in kind of a landscape structure. But in the gouache, you have this. And so, in a way, we have made a long trip, let's say, from the nuns of Plamondon to the abstraction of Bourdieu. What happened, as I tried to show you, it is this kind of internalization of this concept of that we had in the departure. What was an essence only, something, an ideal to follow, becomes suddenly something that gives you freedom and joy and pleasure instead of just being imposed on you. And this is, I think, what Bourdieu felt, and it's not surprising that later, in 1948, he will write the famous manifesto, the Refus Global, which will attack both the church and the kind of narrow nationalism in which Quebec was in at the time, and will also call for a kind of new opening and new freedom, and speaking even of anarchy of all things. So you see that this first figure that we have seen is in fact was patent of a kind of evolution, of a kind of development, and that from the nuns of Plamondon to the abstraction of Bourdieu, we have this process of internalization, of transformation, let's say, of an essence into existence, into act, and finally even getting up to the political level. Next time we will deal with a new figure. We will start from the figure of the habitant that I said was the second figure I wanted to show you, and which also you will see ask our good problem of the same type. We will see again an evolution toward something else. This will be our next lecture.